She handed him the chipped mug every morning at dawn. He smelled of rain, old leather, and hard labor. For 3 months, he was just Tom, the quiet, stable hand with grease on his knuckles and a steady, observant gaze. He was the only person on the crumbling estate who treated her like a human being instead of a servant. Then, the black carriages rolled up the gravel drive. The heavy doors swung open, and there he stood. Not in a rough linen shirt, but wrapped in a dark velvet greatcoat. The new Duke. The floorboards in the attic room always froze in November. Jane pressed her bare feet against the warped wood, her breath pluming in the grey light of a 5 a.m. dawn. There was no fire in her grate. Firewood was for the paying guests, if they ever had any, and for the ground floor, where the damp threatened to eat through the plaster. She pulled a heavy, moth-eaten woolen shawl over her shoulders. Her fingers were stiff, the knuckles red and chafed from lye soap. She was the niece of the late master of Fenwick Hall, which meant absolutely nothing in the eyes of the law, but meant everything to the creditors. When her uncle had died, he had left nothing but a mountain of gambling debts and a sprawling, decaying manor in Yorkshire. Jane had stayed because there was nowhere else to go. She was the housekeeper, the accountant, and occasionally the scullery maid, holding the estate together with twine and sheer, stubborn spite. Downstairs, the kitchen was a cavern of cold iron and stone. Mrs. Gable, the cook, wouldn't be down for another hour. Jane liked this time of day. It was the only hour that belonged entirely to her. She sparked the flint, coaxing a small flame into the hearth, and set the iron kettle over it. While the water heated, she went to the pantry. On the highest shelf, hidden behind a tin of stale flour, was a small paper bag of loose-leaf black tea. A luxury. A ridiculous, unjustifiable luxury she had smuggled from the village market 3 months ago. She measured out exactly 2 pinches into a small ceramic pot. When the kettle whistled, she poured the water, watching the dark amber color bleed into the boiling liquid. She took 2 mugs from the rack. One was a sturdy brown clay. The other was white porcelain, missing its handle and chipped at the rim, a remnant of a dinner set from 50 years ago. Jane poured the tea. No sugar, no milk. They couldn't afford it. She wrapped her hands around the hot ceramic, kicked the heavy oak kitchen door open, and stepped out into the biting morning air. The courtyard was frozen solid, the mud hardened into jagged ridges. Frost clung to the dead eye on the brick walls. Jane walked briskly across the yard, her boots crunching loud in the silence. The smell of the stables hit her before she opened the doors, a warm, heavy mixture of hay, manure, and horse sweat. Compared to the house, it was an oven. A lantern burned low by the main stalls. "You're going to break the pitchfork, hitting the stone like that." The rhythmic scraping stopped. A man stepped out from the 3rd stall, wiping the back of his hand across his forehead. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a linen shirt that had seen better days. The sleeves rolled up past his elbows despite the cold. His boots were caked in muck. Tom, he had arrived in late August, walking up the drive looking for work. Jane had hired him on the spot because he asked for half the wages the last stable master had demanded, and because he hadn't looked at her with the pity she usually got from the locals. "The stone is uneven," Tom said. His voice was a low, rough baritone that didn't entirely match the ragged clothes. His accent was hard to place. Sometimes it slipped into the local rough burr, but other times, when he was tired, it flattened out into something sharper, something educated. Jane didn't ask. Everyone at Fenwick Hall had something they were running from. She held out the chipped white mug. Tom leaned the pitchfork against the wooden partition. He took a step forward, stripping off his heavy leather work gloves, and reached for the tea. His hands were large, scarred, and stained with dirt, but he took the fragile, broken cup with surprising gentleness. Their fingers brushed. His were freezing. "Thank you," he murmured. "Don't thank me," Jane said, leaning against the wooden post of the stall, wrapping both hands around her own brown mug. "It's entirely self-serving. If you freeze to death, I have to muck out the stalls myself. I detest shoveling manure." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was a good mouth, bracketed by a dark, uneven shadow of stubble. He brought the mug to his lips and drank the tea, black and scalding. "Barnaby favored his left hind leg yesterday," Tom said, nodding toward the large bay gelding resting in the corner. "I packed it with clay, but he shouldn't be ridden today." "No one is riding him anyway," Jane said, staring into her tea. "The carriage is rotting in the shed, and we have nowhere to go." Silence settled between them. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers, but the heavy, settled quiet of two exhausted people who didn't require small talk. This had become their ritual. Every morning for 3 months, at 6 o'clock, she brought him tea. They stood in the dim light of the lantern, surrounded by breathing horses, and existed for 10 minutes without being defined by their burdens. Tom looked at her over the rim of his cup. His eyes were a dark, unreadable grey. He noticed things. Jane knew. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the fraying hem of her grey dress, the way she favoured her left hip when the damp weather set in. But he never offered unwanted sympathy. "You were up late," he noted quietly. Candle was burning in the estate office until 3. Jane sighed, closing her eyes and resting the back of her head against the wooden post. The creditors from London sent another letter. They want to assess the timber on the West Ridge. If they cut down those trees, the soil will wash away by spring. But they don't care. They just see numbers on a ledger. "And the owner?" Tom asked, his voice neutral. Jane let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "The Duke? He's probably choking on a quail bone at some lavish breakfast in Mayfair. He inherited this land 2 years ago and hasn't stepped foot on it once. Men like him don't care about dirt and timber. They care about tailor bills and mistresses. He's a parasite." Tom took a slow sip of his tea. His jaw flexed slightly. "Parasite. A strong word. An accurate one," Jane snapped, suddenly angry, though not at him. "He bleeds this land dry to fund his city life, while the tenants here patch their roofs with mud. If I ever met his grace, I would gladly pour this boiling tea straight into his lap." Tom lowered his mug. He looked down at the dark liquid, his expression completely unreadable. Then he let out a short, quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "I'll be sure to warn him," Tom said, "if he ever shows his face." Jane pushed off the post. "I need to go. Mrs. Gable will be awake, and she burns the porridge if I'm not there to watch her." She reached out her hand. Tom handed back the chipped mug. He didn't let go immediately. For a fraction of a second, the weight of the cup was suspended between them. "Get some sleep tonight, Jane," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his low voice sent a strange, unfamiliar jolt through her chest. She pulled the mug away, her defenses instantly snapping back into place. "Sleep doesn't pay the debts, Tom. Have Barnaby brushed by noon." She turned and walked out of the warm stables, back into the freezing frost. 2 weeks later, the sky broke open. It wasn't a gentle English drizzle. It was a torrential, angry downpour that turned the courtyard into a swamp and battered the slate roof of the manor like artillery fire. Jane spent the morning running up and down the main staircase with metal buckets, catching the leaks that sprang up in the grand gallery. The faded portraits of long-dead aristocrats looked down at her mockingly as she hauled sloshing buckets of dirty rainwater out the back door. By 3 in the afternoon, her shoulders were screaming, her dress was soaked to the knees, and a profound, cynical despair had settled in her bones. She dragged the last bucket down the hall and stopped. The heavy oak doors of the library were slightly ajar. Jane pushed the door open. The library was the only room in the house she fiercely protected. It held thousands of volumes, smelling of old paper and dust. But today, the sound of rhythmic dripping echoed near the back window. Tom was there. He had hauled a heavy wooden ladder from the shed and was standing near the top of it, working a piece of heavy canvas over a crack in the plaster ceiling. Rainwater dripped steadily onto his shoulders, soaking through his linen shirt, plastering it to his back. The muscles in his shoulders shifted and pulled tight under the wet fabric as he hammered a nail into the joist. Jane stood frozen in the doorway. She had not asked him to do this. His job was the horses. He struck the nail one last time, tested the canvas, and then paused, looking down. He saw her standing there, a dripping bucket in her hand, her hair plastered to her forehead. "It won't hold forever," Tom said, descending the ladder with a fluid, easy grace. "The flashing on the roof is completely rotted, but it will keep the books dry for today." He stepped off the bottom rung. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. His dark hair was soaked, curling slightly at the ends. Up close, in the dim light of the library, Jane noticed a thin, faded scar cutting through the rugged line of his jaw. "You shouldn't be in here," Jane said. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. She was exhausted, and his unprompted kindness felt like a threat to the walls she had carefully built around herself. Tom didn't flinch. He picked up a rag from the floor and wiped his hands. I saw the water pooling outside the window. Knew this room sat beneath it. "It's not your job. Your maid is 70 years old, and your cook has a bad hip," Tom said evenly, closing the distance between them. He stopped a few feet away, towering over her. "Who else was going to carry the ladder, Jane? You? I managed just fine." "I know you do." Tom's voice dropped, losing the hard edge. "I see how hard you work. You don't have to carry the entire house on your back. If I don't, it collapses." She set the bucket down hard. The clatter echoed in the quiet room. "I have to catalogue these books. The Duke's men are coming next month. They sent a letter this morning. They want an inventory of the library. They're going to sell it." Tom froze. The rag in his hands went still. "Sell the books?" "Everything of value," Jane said, turning her back to him to look at the massive shelves. She crossed her arms, shivering as the dampness of her dress seeped into her skin. "They need to liquidate assets to cover the estate's arrears. It seems His Grace is tired of carrying a dead weight in Yorkshire. He wants cash." She reached out and touched the spine of a leather-bound volume of poetry. It had been her father's favorite before the gambling took him. "It's just paper," Jane whispered, her voice betraying a tremor she hated. "I shouldn't care. But I've dusted these shelves for 5 years. I know every title, and some fat, powdered lord in London is going to pawn them off to buy a new racehorse." She felt the warmth of him before he spoke. Tom had moved up behind her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, breaking through the chill of the damp room. "Perhaps," Tom said, his voice a low rumble right behind her ear, "the Duke isn't entirely aware of what his men are doing. Estates are complex. Stewards make decisions." "Don't defend him," Jane said bitterly, refusing to turn around. "Ignorance is not an excuse. Power demands responsibility. If you own the land, you own the people on it, the roof over it, the debts tied to it. If he doesn't know, he's a fool. If he does know, he's a tyrant." Silence stretched. The only sound was the muffled drumming of the rain against the glass and the quiet dripping of water onto the canvas above them. "You're right," Tom said quietly. Jane finally turned. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. The mask of the quiet, simple, stable hand had slipped entirely. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and heavily burdened. He looked like a man who was carrying a weight far heavier than damp canvas. He reached out. Jane stiffened, but she didn't pull away. Tom's rough, calloused fingers brushed a wet strand of hair away from her cheek. His touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the heavy labor his hands performed every day. His thumb lingered for a second on her jawline. "You are shivering," he said softly. "I'm fine," she lied. "Go to the kitchen, sit by the fire. I'll finish up here." Jane wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on her spine. She looked into his grey eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, allowed herself to surrender control to someone else. "Don't drop the ladder on the mahogany desk," she muttered. Tom smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face from rugged to strikingly handsome. "I'll treat it like glass, my lady." Jane turned and walked away, her heart hammering a strange, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She was a cynical woman. She knew better than to rely on transient men who worked for daily wages. But as she sat by the fire an hour later, wrapped in a blanket, all she could think about was the rough heat of his thumb against her skin. 3 days later, the letter arrived. It bore a heavy red wax seal stamped with the crest of a wolf. Jane stared at it on the silver saloon tray for a full minute before breaking it open. As she read the heavy looping script, her stomach plummeted into her boots. Mrs. Gable, who was kneading dough on the butcher block, stopped and wiped her hands on her apron. "What is it, Miss Jane? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Jane said, dropping the parchment onto the table. "The Duke of Penrith," Mrs. Gable gasped, making the sign of the cross, a habit from her youth. "He's dead? The old man?" "No," Jane said, her mind racing, calculating food supplies, clean linen, the state of the guest chambers. "The old Duke died 2 years ago, remember? This is the new one, and he is coming here tomorrow." "Tomorrow!" Mrs. Gable shrieked. "But the east wing is closed off. The rugs are full of moths. We don't have enough meat to feed a ducal party." "We have to make do," Jane said, her voice instantly snapping into the commanding tone of a battlefield general. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Send a boy to the village. We need 2 hams, whatever fresh vegetables they have, and coffee. Real coffee. I will open the master suite in the west wing. It's the only one without a leak. Get Sarah to help you pull the Holland covers off the furniture." The next 24 hours were a blur of frenzied, back-breaking labor. Jane scrubbed floors until her knees bled. She polished silver that hadn't seen the light of day in a decade. She aired out feather mattresses and built roaring fires in grates that smoked from disuse. She didn't sleep. By the time 5 a.m. rolled around the next morning, she was running purely on adrenaline and anxiety. Out of habit, she went to the kitchen, stoked the fire and made the tea. 2 pinches of the black leaves, the brown clay mug, the chipped white porcelain. She walked across the frosted courtyard, her mind spinning with a checklist of 100 things left to do. Sweep the front steps. Check the wine cellar. Iron the good tablecloth. She pushed open the heavy stable doors. "Tom, I need you to polish the brass on the front gates. The carriage is arriving by noon," and she stopped. The lantern was unlit. The stables were quiet, save for the soft nickering of the horses. The pitchfork was leaning neatly against the wall. The stalls were already mucked out. "Tom?" she called out. Only the heavy silence answered her. Jane walked down the aisle, checking the tack room. Empty. His heavy leather apron was draped over a chair. His boots were gone. A cold, heavy stone formed in her stomach. It wasn't uncommon for laborers to run off when nobilities arrived. Dukes brought their own staff, their own masters of horse. Sometimes they fired the local help on a whim. Or perhaps Tom simply didn't want to deal with the chaos and demands of a royal visit. But he had left without saying a word. Without his tea. Jane looked down at the chipped white mug in her hand. The steam was already dissipating in the cold air. A sharp, unexpected sting of betrayal bit at her eyes. She swallowed it down violently. "Fool," she berated herself. "He was a transient laborer. You were an employer. Did you expect him to and fight your battles?" She dumped the tea into the dirt, the dark liquid staining the straw. She turned on her heel and marched back to the house. There was no time for bruised feelings. The wolf was at the door. At precisely noon, the distant crunch of gravel announced their arrival. Jane stood on the front steps of the manor, flanked by Mrs. Gable in a clean white apron, and Sarah, the elderly maid, who was visibly trembling. Jane wore her best dress, a dark navy wool that was terribly out of fashion, but free of patches. She stood with her spine rigidly straight, her chin tipped up, preparing to face the man who was coming to strip her home down to the floorboards. Two massive black carriages, pulled by matching teams of greys, swept up the circular drive. The mud on their wheels did nothing to diminish their opulence. The crest of the wolf was emblazoned in gold on the doors. A footman in dark livery jumped down from the back of the first carriage before it had even fully stopped. He opened the door, snapped to attention, and lowered the steps. Jane braced herself. She expected an older man, soft around the middle, draped in silk, perhaps clutching a cane and complaining about the state of the roads. A tall man stepped out of the carriage. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored velvet greatcoat over a charcoal waistcoat and a crisp, white cravat. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, free of a single speck of mud. He stood for a moment, adjusting the cuff of his coat, looking up at the imposing facade of the crumbling manor. Jane's breath physically left her body. Mrs. Gable made a small, choked sound of confusion. The man turned his head. His eyes, a dark, unreadable grey, locked instantly onto Jane standing on the top step. The rough stubble was gone, shaved clean to reveal the hard, aristocratic lines of his jaw and the faint, pale scar she had stared at in the library 3 days ago. His dark hair was brushed back, neat and controlled. He did not smell of hay and horse sweat. Even from a distance, he looked like power, wealth, and undeniable authority. But it was him, Tom. Jane couldn't move, she couldn't speak. Her mind shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, trying to reconcile the man who had fixed her leaking roof in a wet linen shirt with the Duke of Penrith standing before her. He didn't look away from her. He began to walk up the steps, his gait no longer the tired, heavy tread of a labourer, but the confident, predatory stalk of a nobleman entering his domain. As he reached the top step, he stopped mere inches from Jane. The rest of the staff dropped into deep curtsies. Jane remained standing, frozen, her eyes wide, locked on his face. A tense silence stretched. The footman watched nervously. "Miss Fielding?" he said. His low baritone was exactly the same, yet stripped of any rustic camouflage. It was smooth, educated, and commanding. Jane's throat worked. But no sound came out. The betrayal, the realization, the sheer audacity of it all crashed over her like a tidal wave. He leaned in slightly, close enough that she could smell cedarwood and fine soap, and lowered his voice so only she could hear. "I believe," the Duke of Penrith murmured softly, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "You promised to pour boiling tea into my lap." Jane's mind went entirely blank. The blood rushed from her extremities, pooling hot and heavy in her chest. She looked at the immaculate cut of his coat, the signet ring catching the pale afternoon light on his right hand, the subtle, arrogant tilt of his head. The man she had ordered to muck out stalls, the man she had pitied for his worn boots, the man who had touched her face in the damp gloom of the library. It had all been a lie, a grotesque, theatrical farce played by a bored nobleman, slumming it in the dirt. The shock receded, instantly replaced by a white-hot, razor-sharp fury. It burned through the exhaustion of the past 24 hours. Jane did not scream. She did not throw a tantrum or dissolve into tears. Instead, she locked her knees, smoothed her hands down the front of her faded wool skirt, and executed a stiff, technically perfect curtsy. It was a mechanical drop of the knee, devoid of any genuine respect. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was ice over a deep, dark lake. "Welcome to Fenwick Hall. I apologize for the lack of boiling tea. Had I known you were arriving, I would have put the kettle on sooner." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or regret, crossed his grey eyes. But his expression remained a mask of polite aristocracy. "The manner looks well, Miss Fielding," Thomas replied, matching her formal tone. "Given the circumstances, we have prepared the master suite in the West Wing for you," Jane continued, refusing to meet his gaze. She looked firmly at the crisp fold of his cravat. "Your staff may use the servants' quarters on the 3rd floor. I have instructed Mrs. Gable to prepare dinner for 8 o'clock. If that meets your approval, that'll be fine. Then I shall leave you to get settled. If you require anything, your valet may ring the kitchen." Jane pivoted sharply on her heel. She did not wait for his dismissal. She walked back into the cavernous hallway of the manor, her spine rigid, her footsteps echoing sharply against the stone floor. She ignored the confused, terrified whispers of Mrs. Gable and Sarah as they hurried past her to assist the Duke's invading army of liveried footmen. She walked straight to the estate office, went inside, and locked the heavy oak door behind her. Alone in the dim, dust-moated room, Jane leaned back against the wood. Her lungs burned. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her hands against her temples. Parasite. I would gladly pour this boiling tea straight into his lap. She had said that to his face. She had insulted him, ordered him around, shared her meager, smuggled tea with him. He had listened to her complain about the estate's ruin, all while holding the deed in his own pocket. Why the deception? She pushed off the door and moved to the massive, scarred mahogany desk. The ledgers lay open, pages filled with her cramped, frantic handwriting, detailing debts they could never pay. He had played a cruel game, and she had been the unwitting entertainment. She felt violated. The quiet camaraderie they had shared in the mornings, the unspoken understanding, it was all manufactured. A sharp knock rapped against the door. Jane jumped. "Miss Fielding." The low, commanding voice vibrated through the heavy wood. Jane gripped the edge of the desk. "The office is currently locked, Your Grace. I am compiling the inventory you requested for your agents." "Open the door, Jane." The use of her given name, spoken in that familiar, rough cadence, felt like a physical blow. "It is highly inappropriate for the Duke of Penrith to address the housekeeper by her first name," she called back, her voice tight. "I will present the ledgers to you in the morning." Silence fell on the other side of the door. For a long moment, she thought he had left. Then, the heavy brass doorknob rattled violently. "I have the master key, Miss Fielding," Thomas said. The aristocratic Polish had cracked, revealing the hard, unyielding tone of the man she had argued with in the stables. "You can open it or I will. But we are going to speak." Jane gritted her teeth. She marched to the door and turned the iron key, throwing the door open. Thomas stepped inside, filling the small space instantly. He closed the door behind him with a firm, decisive click. He had shed the velvet greatcoat, but he still wore the charcoal waistcoat and crisp shirt. He looked dangerous, entirely out of place among the dust and peeling wallpaper. "Do not ever lock a door on me in my own house," he said quietly. Jane crossed her arms, tilting her chin up to meet his glare. "Your house? Of course. Forgive me. I forgot my place. I was under the impression I was dealing with a laborer who respected personal boundaries, not a duke who dictates them." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his immaculately styled hair, ruining the perfect sweep of it. Suddenly, he looked a little more like Tom. "Jane, stop." "Stop what, Your Grace?" she snapped, the anger finally spilling over. "Stop being angry that you spent 3 months lying to my face? Stop feeling humiliated that I treated you like a human being while you were secretly assessing my competence?" "I wasn't assessing your competence," he countered sharply, stepping closer. "I was assessing the rot." "What rot?" "The rot left by my father. The rot left by your uncle." Thomas planted his hands on the edge of the desk, leaning over it. "When I inherited this title, I inherited 50 estates, 30 of which were bleeding money into the pockets of corrupt stewards and lazy tenants. I was told Fenwick Hall was a lost cause, a money pit managed by a spinster niece who was likely skimming off the top." Jane gasped, her hands curling into fists. "I have never stolen a single penny." "I know that now," he said, his voice dropping, losing its heat. "But I didn't know it then. If I had rode up in a carriage 3 months ago, everyone would have lied to me. The ledgers would have been cooked. The staff would have hidden the damage. I needed to see the truth of this place with my own eyes. I needed to know what I owned." "So you played dress-up," Jane sneered. "You put on a dirty shirt and mocked us." "I didn't mock you." He looked at her, his grey eyes intense and unwavering. "I worked alongside you. I froze in that stable. I shoveled manure. I saw what you deal with every single day, Jane. I saw you holding this crumbling stone together with nothing but your own will. I saw you." Jane swallowed hard, refusing to let the sudden, treacherous warmth in her chest show on her face. "And now you've seen it. You've had your fun. You can sell the timber, sell the books, and go back to Mayfair. Just give me a week to pack my things." Thomas stiffened. "You are not leaving. I am not your servant." "No," Thomas said, his voice deadly serious. "You're the only honest person I've met in 2 years." The following week was a study in psychological warfare. The dynamic of Fenwick Hall had shifted violently. The Duke's London staff, a highly trained, silent army of footmen, valets, and maids, took over the daily operations. Mrs. Gable was relegated to baking bread, while a French chef dominated the kitchen. Sarah was retired with a generous pension, replaced by brisk, efficient young women who sneered at the dust in the corners. Jane found herself a ghost in the home she had run for 5 years. She had no duties, yet she was not a guest. She was a fixture, trapped in the strange limbo Thomas had created by refusing to let her leave. She spent her days in the estate office, stubbornly refusing to yield the ledgers to the Duke's severe-looking accountant, a Mr. Finch. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Jane was hunched over the desk, her fingers stained with ink, trying to balance a column of figures related to the tenant farms. The door opened without a knock. Thomas walked in. He was dressed in riding clothes, tall leather boots, fitted breeches, and a dark riding coat damp with rain. He smelled of wet wool and the outdoors. For a split second, Jane's heart did a painful stutter step, remembering the stable hand. She forced her eyes back to the page. "Your Grace, Mr. Finch is not here." "I didn't come to see Finch," Thomas said. He pulled up a wooden chair and sat down opposite her, ignoring the layer of dust on the seat. "What are you working on?" "The Miller farm," Jane replied curtly, not looking up. "Their roof caved in during the snowstorm last winter. My uncle refused to pay for the repairs. They are withholding rent until it's fixed, as is their right." Thomas reached across the desk and pulled the heavy ledger out from under her hands. "Hey!" Jane protested, reaching for it. Thomas held it out of her reach, his eyes scanning the cramped numbers. He frowned. "They've been paying half rent for a year. The cost of the roof is 3 times what they owe." "Then fix the roof, Your Grace," Jane said, her voice dripping with cynical sweetness. or evict them and let the farm rot completely. Those are your choices." Thomas closed the ledger with a heavy thud. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You enjoy this, don't you? Pushing me, reminding me of my obligations. Someone has to. I cancelled the timber assessment," he stated quietly. Jane froze. The ink on her quill dripped onto the blotter. You did? "I read your notes in the margins of the land survey," Thomas said, leaning back in the chair. "You were right. Stripping the West Ridge would cause a landslide by spring. It would ruin the lower pastures. The agents in London only saw the immediate profit. They didn't calculate the long-term devastation." Jane stared at him, genuinely shocked. She had fought that battle for 6 months, screaming into the void of the London offices, and he had just stopped it. "And the books?" she asked, her voice smaller than she liked. "The library remains untouched," Thomas said. "I have no need for a few £100 of pawned leather." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, bringing his face closer to hers. The air in the small office suddenly felt very thick. "I am not my father, Jane," he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate register that always made her skin prickle. "I am not your uncle. I am not trying to destroy this place. I am trying to save it." "Why?" Jane asked, her cynicism flaring up as a defense mechanism. "It's a money pit in Yorkshire. You hate it here. You said so yourself when you were Tom." "I hated the idea of it," Thomas corrected. "I hated the burden. But then I came here. I saw the reality." His eyes dropped briefly to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "And I found things here worth keeping." Jane's breath caught. She pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. She needed distance. "You're playing games again, Your Grace," she said, wrapping her arms tightly around her waist. "I am a ruined gentleman's niece with no dowry, no standing, and calluses on my hands. You are a duke. Do not patronize me with veiled compliments." Thomas stood up slowly. He didn't look angry. He looked determined. "Show me your hands, Jane." "No." He walked around the desk. Jane backed up until her shoulders hit the bookshelves. Thomas stopped a foot away. He reached out and gently, but firmly, took her right hand. She tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. He turned her hand over. He looked at the ink stains on her fingers, the red, chafed knuckles from years of lye soap, the small, pale scar on her palm from a broken teacup. He didn't sneer. He didn't look repulsed. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas lowered his head and pressed his lips to the center of her rough, calloused palm. A jolt of pure electric shock shot up Jane's arm. Her entire body trembled. "These hands," Thomas whispered against her skin, "have held my estate together when my own blood let it fall apart. They are the most beautiful things I have ever seen." He released her hand and stepped back, leaving her completely paralyzed against the bookshelves. "Dinner is at 8, he said smoothly, the aristocratic mask slipping flawlessly back into place. "Wear something warm. The dining room is drafty." He walked out of the office, leaving Jane gasping for air in the quiet, dusty room. By 8 o'clock, Jane had managed to reconstruct her cynical armor. It was brittle, but it was in place. She wore her only formal gown, a dark, muted green velvet that had belonged to her mother. It was 10 years out of fashion, lacking the high waistlines and sheer overlays currently popular in London, but the fabric was rich and hid the frantic beating of her heart. She pinned her dark hair up severely, refusing to let a single curl escape. She would not be seduced by a kiss on the palm. She was a realist. Dukes did not marry housekeepers, and she would not be his mistress. She walked into the grand dining room. It was transformed. The massive chandelier, dark for 5 years, was blazing with 50 wax candles. The long mahogany table gleamed under a crisp white damask cloth. The Fenwick silver, which Jane had polished until her hands bled just a week prior, was laid out flawlessly. Thomas stood by the roaring fire at the end of the room. He was dressed in formal evening attire, a black tailcoat that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, a stark white waistcoat, and a masterfully tied cravat. He looked magnificent. He looked entirely out of her reach. He turned as she entered. His eyes swept over the dark green velvet, lingering for a fraction of a second on the curve of her neck. "Miss Fielding," he said, offering his arm. Jane ignored the arm. She walked past him and took her seat near the middle of the table. "Your Grace." A footman pulled out the chair at the head of the table for Thomas. The meal began in tense silence. Course after course was served with choreographed precision by the London staff. The food was exquisite. Consommé, roasted pheasant, glazed carrots. But it tasted like ash in Jane's mouth. She felt the silent, judging eyes of the footmen on her. They knew who she was. The woman who used to scrub the floors was now dining with the master. The whispered gossip in the servants' hall must be vicious. Thomas, however, seemed entirely unfazed. He drank his wine and watched her. "You haven't touched your pheasant," he noted. "I am unaccustomed to such rich food," Jane replied, staring at her plate. "Usually at this hour, I am eating cold porridge in the kitchen. Those days are over." "Are they?" Jane looked up, her dark eyes flashing. "Because I sit at this table, in a dress I cannot afford to replace, eating food I did not pay for. This is a temporary illusion, Your Grace. When you return to London, the porridge will still be waiting for me." Thomas set his wine glass down. The crystal clinked sharply against the quiet room. He signaled the footman with a brief nod. "Leave us," he commanded. The servants filed out instantly, closing the heavy double doors behind them. The room suddenly felt cavernous and terribly intimate. The fire cracked loudly in the grate. "I am not returning to London," Thomas said. Jane frowned, confused. "The season begins in a month. Your seat in the House of Lords can wait," Thomas interrupted. "I have spent the last 2 years wading through the shallow, toxic waters of London society. I am suffocating there. Every conversation is a transaction. Every smile is a calculation. I came to Yorkshire to liquidate this estate and cut my ties to the past." "And now?" Jane asked cautiously. "Now," Thomas said, standing up from the head of the table. He walked slowly down the length of the room until he stood behind her chair. "I find that I prefer the mud. I prefer a woman who hands me a chipped mug of smuggled tea and tells me to my face that I am a parasite." Jane's breath hitched. She stared straight ahead, gripping the edge of the table. "You are confusing novelty with reality," she whispered, fighting the desperate urge to lean back into him. "I am a novelty to you, a woman who doesn't fawn over your title. But the novelty will wear off. And when it does, the reality is that I am a commoner, and you are a duke." Thomas placed his hands on the back of her chair. He leaned down, his face hovering just inches from her ear. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by reality, Jane. It is cold, and it is empty." His voice was a raw, rough rumble. "The only time I have felt entirely like a man, and not a title, was when I was standing in a freezing stable, arguing with you." He moved around the chair, crouching down so he was eye level with her. He reached out and gently took her chin in his hand, forcing her to look at him. His grey eyes were completely stripped of their aristocratic armor. They were vulnerable, intense, and terrifyingly sincere. "I don't want a duchess who knows how to hold a fan," Thomas said softly. "I want a woman who knows how to hold a roof up in a storm. Tell me to leave you alone, Jane. Tell me you feel nothing when I look at you. and I will pack my carriages tomorrow, and you will never see me again." Jane stared into his eyes. Her cynical heart, the fortress she had built to survive the crushing disappointment of her life, was fracturing. She opened her mouth, fully intending to tell the lie that would save her. She started, but the words died in her throat. She couldn't do it. She couldn't lie. Not to him. Thomas saw the fracture. He saw the truth in her dark eyes. He stood up, pulling her up with him. Before Jane could process the movement, his arms were around her, pulling her flush against his chest, and his mouth came down hard on hers. The kiss tasted of expensive claret and raw, unvarnished desperation. For 3 seconds, Jane surrendered. Her hands, rough and calloused, slid up the impeccably tailored lapels of his tailcoat and gripped the fabric like a lifeline. She felt the heavy, thudding rhythm of his heart against her chest. The heat of him drove the chill from her bones, melting the cynical ice she had spent 5 years carefully cultivating. Then her brain caught up with her heart. Jane broke the kiss, shoving her hands against his chest. She stumbled backward, her velvet skirt catching on the leg of the mahogany chair. She was gasping for air, her pulse roaring in her ears. Thomas didn't pursue her. He stood perfectly still, his chest heaving, his grey eyes dark and bruised with emotion. He raised a hand, rubbing the back of his knuckles across his mouth. "Don't!" Jane choked out, holding up a trembling hand. "Do not do that. Do not turn me into a cliché." "There is nothing cliché about this, Jane," Thomas said. His voice was unsteady. "It is the oldest story in the world," she fired back, her voice echoing sharply in the cavernous dining room. "The bored aristocrat and the desperate servant. It ends with me ruined in a London gutter, and you married to an earl's daughter with a pristine reputation and soft hands. I just told you I have no intention of returning to London." "People lie, Your Grace," Jane shouted. The title felt like a weapon now. They lie when the reality of mud and debt becomes too heavy. You survived 3 months in disguise because you knew you could strip it off the moment it became inconvenient. This is my life. I cannot strip it off. If I give you everything, and you wake up one morning, missing your gentlemen's clubs and your spotless boots, I will have nothing left." Thomas stepped forward. "I am not leaving you." "You don't know that," Jane whispered. The anger drained out of her, leaving only a hollow, aching exhaustion. "You don't know what it takes to live in the dark for years on end. You've only just turned off the light." She turned around, lifting the heavy skirts of her mother's dress, and walked toward the grand double doors. "Jane," he called out. "Good night, Your Grace," she said without looking back. The next morning, the grand illusion of the Duke's dinner shattered under the harsh grey light of reality. Jane awoke at 5:00 a.m., driven by a biological clock she couldn't silence. Her room was freezing. She dressed in her worn grey wool, tying her apron with mechanical precision. She walked down to the kitchen, but the fire was already roaring. The French chef was shouting at a scullery maid in rapid, angry bursts. Mrs. Gable was sitting in the corner, peeling potatoes with a look of defeated resignation. There was no space for Jane here. She walked past the kitchen and down the corridor toward the estate office. The door was ajar. Inside, Mr. Finch, the Duke's severe, pinch-faced accountant, was sitting at her desk. He was packing her meticulous, hand-written ledgers into a leather traveling case. "What are you doing?" Jane demanded, stepping into the room. Finch looked up, adjusting his spectacles. "Ah, Miss Fielding. His Grace has instructed me to return to London this afternoon. I am taking the estate records with me to properly consolidate the accounts." Jane's stomach plummeted. "Those ledgers belong to Fenwick Hall. They are the only record of the tenant debts and the structural repairs needed. They belong to the Duke of Penrith," Finch corrected smoothly, snapping the leather case shut. "And as His Grace's primary financial officer, I require them. The Duke may be indulging in a temporary rustic retreat, but the business of the estate must be managed by professionals, not housekeepers. The insult wasn't veiled. It was a direct, calculated strike. "Did he authorize this?" Jane asked, her voice deadening. Finch offered a thin, pitying smile. "His Grace authorized me to handle the transition. He is a busy man, Miss Fielding. He relies on his staff to shield him from the tedious details. You have done an admirable job keeping the roof from entirely caving in, but your services in this capacity are no longer required. I have authorized a severance payment for you. It is quite generous." He pushed a small leather pouch across the desk. It clinked heavily. Jane stared at the pouch. It was the physical manifestation of her deepest fear. Thomas had promised her the world in the dark, but in the daylight, his machinery was already turning, pushing her out, erasing her authority, reducing her to a paid-off nuisance. She didn't touch the gold. "Keep it," Jane said. Her voice was devoid of emotion. "I won't need it." She turned and walked out of the office. The decision crystallized in her mind, cold and sharp. She had survived her uncle's neglect. She had survived the creditors. She would not survive having her heart broken by a man who didn't even realize his own staff was orchestrating her exit. It took Jane exactly 20 minutes to pack 5 years of her life. She owned very little. 2 faded dresses, a few pairs of woolen stockings, a sturdy pair of boots, and the leather-bound book of poetry she had taken from the library. She packed them into a battered canvas satchel. She didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the Yorkshire sky had opened up again. It wasn't a torrential downpour, but a steady, freezing drizzle that turned the courtyard into a slick expanse of grey mud. Jane pulled her woolen shawl tightly around her head and shoulders, grabbed her satchel, and walked out the back door. She would walk the 3 miles to the village and catch the postal coach to York. She had a distant cousin there who might take her in as a seamstress. It was a bleak, miserable prospect, but it belonged to her. Her boots squelched in the mud as she made her way across the yard. The cold rain stung her cheeks. She passed the stables. The heavy wooden doors were slightly ajar. Jane stopped. Despite her resolve, she couldn't walk past without looking one last time. She pushed the door open. The warm, familiar smell of hay and horse sweat washed over her. The lantern was lit, casting long, dancing shadows against the wooden stalls. At the far end in Barnaby's stall, a man was working. He was shoveling soiled hay into a wheelbarrow. He wore a heavy, rain-soaked linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. His boots were caked in muck. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat and dampness. Jane dropped her satchel. It hit the dirt floor with a heavy thud. Thomas froze. He slowly turned around, resting his hands on the handle of the pitchfork. The silence in the stable was absolute, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof and the soft breathing of the horses. He looked at her. He looked at the satchel on the floor. "Finch told me you refused your severance," Thomas said. His voice was a low, rough scrape in the quiet space. "Finch is an efficient man," Jane replied, fighting the tremor in her jaw. "He understands exactly how your world works. I'm just a loose end that needs tying up." Thomas drove the pitchfork hard into the dirt. It stuck there, quivering. He stepped out of the stall. He didn't look like a duke. He looked like the man who had arrived in August, hardened by labor and quietly furious. "Finch is currently packing his carriage," Thomas said, closing the distance between them. "Without the ledgers, because I fired him 10 minutes ago." Jane blinked, stunned. You fired your accountant?" "I fired my steward, my accountant, and the French chef," Thomas said, his grey eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. "Mrs. Gable is back in the kitchen making porridge, and if you try to walk out that gate, I will drag you back in here myself." "You can't do that," Jane stammered, taking a half step back. "I am the Duke of Penrith," Thomas said, stepping closer, entirely ignoring her retreat. "I can do whatever I damn well please." "That is exactly my point," Jane yelled, her frustration boiling over. "You have all the power. You can fire a man. You can hire a man. You can ruin my life with a snap of your fingers. You play at being a laborer, but underneath it all, you still command the world. I have nothing. I am entirely at your mercy, and I refuse to live like that." Thomas stopped. They were 2 feet apart. He looked down at her, the rain dripping from his jaw, the rough stubble back on his face. He reached into the pocket of his damp trousers. He pulled out a folded, heavy piece of parchment, sealed with the wolf crest. He held it out to her. "Take it," he ordered quietly. Jane stared at his scarred, dirt-stained hand. Hesitantly, she reached out and took the paper. She broke the seal and unfolded it. It was a legal document. The handwriting was sharp and aggressively slanted. It was a deed of transfer. Jane's eyes scanned the words, her breath catching in her throat. "This—" She looked up at him, her vision blurring. "This transfers the administration of the Fenwick tenant farms to me, legally." "Not just the administration," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a fierce, raw whisper. "The income, the authority, the legal rights. It is entirely binding. Signed and witnessed by the local magistrate an hour ago. You cannot be fired. You cannot be evicted. You hold the purse strings of half my Yorkshire holdings." Jane stared at the paper. It was a king's ransom. It was complete, unadulterated security. It was the power she had just accused him of hoarding. "Why?" she breathed. "Because you are right," Thomas said, stepping into her space, his hands coming up to cup her face. His thumbs, rough and warm, brushed over her cold cheeks. "I have the power. I have the title. And I despise it. I despise the men who cower before it and the women who scheme for it. You never cared about the title, Jane. You only cared about the roof, the dirt, and the people." He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. "I am not playing at being a laborer," he whispered fiercely. "I am trying to learn how to be a man worthy of you. I don't want a dependent. I want a partner. Take the farms, take the manor, take me." Jane closed her eyes. The cold rain outside faded away. The fear, the cynicism, the years of bitter defense mechanisms crumbled into dust. She felt the solid, unyielding reality of him against her. He wasn't a fairy tale prince. He was a man with dirt on his hands and a scar on his jaw, offering her the one thing no one had ever given her: respect. Jane dropped the parchment. She reached up, sliding her hands around the back of his neck, tangling her fingers in his damp hair, and pulled his mouth down to hers. He kissed her hungrily, a fierce, claiming kiss that tasted of rain and absolute certainty. There was no hesitation this time. His arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly off the dirt floor, holding her against him as if he would never let go. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily. Jane looked up into his grey eyes, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. "You are entirely ridiculous, Your Grace," she murmured. Thomas smiled back, the expression transforming his rugged face. "Call me Tom." "Not a chance," Jane said, stepping out of his embrace and picking up her satchel. "If I am going to run half your estate, I demand appropriate respect. Now pick up that pitchfork. Barnaby's stall isn't going to clean itself." Thomas let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the stable walls. He picked up the pitchfork. "As you wish, my lady." Winter settled hard over Fenwick Hall. The snow drifts piled high against the stone walls, but the manor was no longer a tomb. Fires burned in the grates. The roof in the library had been properly patched by a team of local carpenters, paid for by the Duke's personal accounts. Mrs. Gable hummed as she baked bread, entirely unbothered by French culinary standards. The London staff was gone, replaced by men and women from the village who were paid a fair wage. At 6 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday in January, Jane stood in the warm kitchen. She was no longer wearing the faded grey wool. She wore a deep burgundy dress, simple in its cut but made of fine, heavy material that kept the winter chill at bay. A gold wedding band caught the firelight on her left hand. She reached up to the highest shelf in the pantry. Behind the flour tin, the paper bag of loose-leaf tea remained. She didn't need to smuggle it anymore. Crates of the finest Earl Grey sat in the cellar, but she preferred this bag. She measured out exactly 2 pinches into the small ceramic pot. The water boiled, turning the liquid a dark, fragrant amber. She reached for the mugs. One was sturdy brown clay. The other was white porcelain, missing its handle and chipped at the rim. Jane poured the tea. No sugar, no milk. She wrapped her hands around the hot ceramic, kicked the heavy oak kitchen door open, and stepped out into the biting morning air. The courtyard was covered in a pristine layer of white snow. She walked briskly across the yard, her boots crunching loudly in the silence. She pushed the stable doors open. The lantern burned low by the main stalls. Thomas was there. He wore a heavy wool coat over his linen shirt, a flat cap pulled down over his dark hair. He was brushing Barnaby, his large hands moving in long, soothing strokes over the horse's flank. He stopped as she walked in. The rugged lines of his face softened into a smile that still made Jane's heart skip a beat. Jane walked up to the stall and held out the chipped white mug. Thomas took off his leather glove. He reached out, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. He took the fragile, broken cup with the exact same gentleness he had shown on his very first day. "Thank you," he murmured, bringing the steaming tea to his lips. Jane leaned against the wooden post, wrapping both hands around her brown mug. "You're going to freeze out here. The ledgers for the North Fields need reviewing. We could do it by the fire." Thomas took a slow sip of his black tea, his grey eyes watching her over the rim of the cup. "I'll review the ledgers," he said, his rough baritone vibrating with quiet amusement. "But only if my brilliant, terrifying wife agrees to stop outsmarting the grain merchants. They sent me a letter yesterday, complaining that the Duchess is merciless in her negotiations." Jane smiled, sipping her tea. "The grain merchants are parasites. Tell them the Duchess requires fair market value, or they can try buying from the next county." Thomas laughed softly, stepping closer to her. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing her cheekbone. They stood in the dim light of the lantern, surrounded by breathing horses, exactly where they had started. They weren't a fairy tale. They were dirt, ledgers, calluses, and chipped porcelain. And it was absolutely perfect. Did Jane and Tom's gritty, hard-earned romance capture your heart? If you couldn't get enough of this grounded take on Regency love, where actions speak louder than grand titles, show your support by smashing that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves a fiercely independent heroine and a duke willing to get his hands dirty. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next epic historical storytelling adventure. We've got more breathtaking tales of defiance, passion, and betrayal coming your way. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.